Imagine being hung upside down, legs tied apart, the blood rushing to your head, forcing you to stay awake, every nerve screaming. Now imagine a saw, cold and jagged, biting into your flesh between your legs, sawing slowly, methodically, pulling at sinew and bone, as the executioners work their way up, inch by inch, until it reaches your chest. You are alive for most of it, unable to move, unable to die quickly, feeling every vibration of the blade as it tears you apart. This wasn't a nightmare from some dark fantasy. It was real. Sawing in half was used across medieval Europe and in parts of Asia as a punishment for those society deemed the worst of criminals, traitors, heretics, rebels, and enemies of kings. It was a punishment designed not for a quick death, but for a slow, humiliating, excruciating display of power and fear, a spectacle to be watched by crowds eager to remind themselves what happened to those who dared to step out of line. They didn't just want you dead. They wanted you broken, terrified, your screams ringing out in the market square as a warning to everyone else. They wanted the memory of your death to live on in every trembling peasant and fearful merchant who witnessed it. Because history isn't just dark, it's soaked in blood. And today, we're going to walk through the reality of one of the most horrific execution methods ever devised by humankind. Imagine the fear before it even begins. You are dragged into the square, your screams drowned by the jeers of the crowd. You see the saw, crusted with the dried blood of others who came before you. You know what is coming, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. They strip you naked, in front of everyone, stripping away not only your clothing, but your dignity, your identity, your humanity. Your legs are tied with thick ropes, and you are hoisted upside down, hanging like butchered meat in a market. The blood immediately surges into your skull, pounding in your temples, turning your world red, but it keeps you awake, wide awake, ensuring you will feel every inch of agony. Executioners take their positions, holding the saw between your legs. It begins with the first pull, a jagged tearing as the saw bites into tender flesh, veins, and muscle. Each back and forth motion a promise that death is coming, but not yet. You feel the vibration in your bones, the heat of your blood pouring down over your torso and face, mixing with your tears and screams, blinding you in a salty, metallic stream. They saw slowly, deliberately. This is not meant to be swift. The point is not just to kill you, but to put on a show, to let the market crowd see what happens to those who defy the law or threaten the ruler's power. Children might watch, holding their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with terror. Merchants watch, gripping their wares, the smell of iron, heavy blood saturating the square. Some methods used a vertical sawing, starting between the legs and working down through the pelvis and abdomen toward the chest. Others, though rarer, involved horizontal sawing, cutting through the torso, while the victim was bound upright. Either way, it was an execution that was a performance, designed to break not just your body, but the spirit of anyone who dared to think themselves beyond the reach of the state. Death came slowly. You would remain conscious until the saw reached critical organs or until shock and blood loss finally took you. But that could take a long time. Some would pass out, only to be revived by the pain when the saw hit bone, or when cold water was thrown on them to keep them awake for the crowd's pleasure. Imagine the buzzing of flies around the fresh wounds, the smell of opened intestines mixing with the dirt and sweat of the executioners, the heat of the sun baking your blood onto your skin. You cannot move, cannot fight, cannot plead. You can only scream until your voice breaks, until the saw splits your ribcage like wood, and you choke on your own blood, finally sinking into a darkness that you begged for. Because this was the point. Sawing in half was not just a punishment. It was a message written in blood and agony across the square. This is what happens if you defy power. And the people watched, trembling, the horror etched into their minds long after the body was discarded, and the saw wiped clean for the next victim. Sawing in half was never just about punishment in medieval Europe. It was a brutal of control draped in the banners of faith and royal authority. During the Inquisition, when the church rooted out so-called heretics, witches, and blasphemers, sawing was one of the punishments used to instill fear. Heresy was not just a crime against the church. It was seen as a crime against the stability of society, the divine order, and the king himself. And the punishment had to reflect the severity of that perceived betrayal. In France, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe, chronicles whisper of bodies being torn in two in marketplaces, the executioners working slowly, piece by piece, while priests prayed nearby, urging the condemned to repent, even as the saw split their flesh. Those accused of witchcraft were sometimes subjected to sawing, seen as a righteous cleansing of evil, the blade acting as the sword of God, to cut sin from the body. These executions were not done in the dark of a dungeon, but in the public squares, with church bells tolling, calling the faithful to witness the punishment. Parents would drag their children to watch, forcing them to look so that they would remember what defiance of the church or crown would cost. Merchants closed their stalls, their goods absorbing the coppery scent of blood drifting across the breeze. In some towns in Germany, those accused of sorcery or poisoning were sawn alive under the supervision of local magistrates, sometimes in the presence of clergy, who chanted prayers to save the victim's soul, while the body was methodically destroyed. The saw, often held by two executioners, would tear through flesh and bone, and the victim's screams would echo off the stone walls of medieval streets, merging with the muttering prayers and the hush that would sometimes fall over the crowd when death finally came. There are stories from Eastern Europe of sawing being used during peasant uprisings. Rebels were sawn in half, not only to punish them, but to terrify their supporters into submission. The saw became a symbol of the ruler's absolute power, a clear message that betrayal would be answered with suffering that was not only physical, but deeply psychological. The crowd played its part. Some cheered, urging the executioners to continue, caught in the blood frenzy that public executions often stir. Others stood silent, fear pressing down on their shoulders, as they wondered if one day they too would feel the teeth of the saw, because of a wrong word, a wrong prayer, or a wrong association. And when the sawing was over, the bodies, sometimes the two halves displayed like a butcher's kill, were left hanging or laid out for the town to see. Flies would gather, dogs would sniff at the remains, and the crowd would drift away. The stain on the cobblestones a reminder that the king and the church would brook no disobedience. Sawing in medieval Europe was not just a punishment, it was fear made manifest, a dark dance of power and faith that tore lives apart while reminding the living that their bodies, too, could be forfeit if they ever dared to step out of line. Sawing in half was not confined to the blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval Europe. Across the Middle East and Asia, it found its place as a method of execution that blended cultural beliefs about justice, shame, and spiritual terror. In Persian history, there are references, often tangled within chronicles of conquest and rebellion, of rebels and traitors being sawn apart as punishment for betrayal against the Shah or the state. The Persian legal system, known for its harsh retributive justice, occasionally employed sawing in high-profile executions to cement the ruler's authority. It was meant to send a clear, unmistakable message. Defy the crown, and your body would be split in two, your suffering drawn out on the hot, watching sun. Within the Ottoman Empire, traveler accounts and fragmented records hint at sawing being used as an extreme punishment for bandit leaders and traitors, particularly in frontier provinces where Ottoman control was fragile. Executions were public, meant to instill dread among local populations, ensuring loyalty in regions prone to rebellion or harboring enemies of the state. In China, while lynching death by 1,000 cuts, was more commonly used. There are mentions in legal archives and folklore of criminals being sawed in half for crimes deemed particularly heinous: rebellion, regicide attempts, or treason. In rare but documented instances, the punishment was carried out in a manner designed to degrade the victim spiritually, as Chinese cultural beliefs around death and the integrity of the body meant that such mutilation was a punishment that extended into the afterlife, disrupting reincarnation and ensuring spiritual unrest. Travelers from Europe and the Middle East who ventured into Asia during the medieval period sometimes recorded witnessing or hearing stories of sawing, their accounts often laced with horror and disbelief. These stories filtered back to Europe, adding to the perception of Asia as a land of strange and brutal punishments, even as Europe practiced its own horrors. Across these regions, deterrence was central. Public executions by sawing were staged in busy markets, near city gates, or outside fortress walls, where people would be forced to watch. Parents would warn their children that if they grew up to defy the law, the saw would find them too. Spiritual fear was another weapon. The knowledge that mutilation of the body could result in unrest in the afterlife kept people obedient, fearful not just of pain, but of eternal consequences. And it was about shame as much as fear. Being sawn in half meant exposure of the body in its most vulnerable, helpless state. Blood, screams, and the irreversible ripping apart of the human form became the spectacle, each stroke of the saw reminding the onlookers that the power of the state or the emperor was total, reaching beyond life, into death, and even into the soul. Sawing in the Middle East and Asia was a tool of absolute authority, a punishment that went beyond death to ensure the living remembered and the dead were denied peace. Sawing in half was never a single, uniform practice. Like many of history's darkest punishments, it adapted to the needs of rulers, the cruelty of executioners, and the cultural obsession with making death a spectacle. The most common method was vertical sawing, where the victim was hung upside down. This was not a mercy. It was a calculated cruelty. Hanging upside down ensured that blood rushed to the brain, keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. Executioners would start from the groin or anus, slowly working the saw downward between the legs, through the pelvis, abdomen, and chest cavity. Each movement of the saw was measured, slow, meant to rip flesh and break bone piece by piece, maximizing pain while avoiding a swift death. Horizontal sawing was less common, but equally horrifying. In these cases, the victim was tied upright between two posts or laid across a platform, and the saw was drawn across the body, often at the midsection, slicing into the abdomen or chest. This method risked faster death from massive blood loss or organ damage, but executioners often paused the sawing, letting the victim scream and bleed before continuing. Sometimes the saw would reach the spine, and they would turn the body to continue from another angle, turning the punishment into a drawn-out butchery. Tools used varied across regions and eras. In some places, simple wood-cutting saws were employed, the teeth of the blade biting into flesh and splintering bone. In others, specialized execution saws were crafted, longer, heavier, with two handles so two executioners could pull back and forth, the blade moving like a hungry predator, tearing deeper with each stroke. Saw teeth would often clog with flesh and blood, requiring pauses to clean or reverse the saw to keep the cut going. The sound alone, a rhythmic rasping, wet and sharp, was enough to haunt the crowds who came to watch. Executioners developed techniques to prolong suffering. They learned to avoid major arteries, angling the saw to tear muscle and skin, while delaying the severing of vital organs. They would work in teams, each pull of the saw calculated, each scream of the victim part of the grim ritual. Some would press the blade lightly, to cause shallow cuts first, allowing flies to gather on the wounds before the deeper cuts began. Comparisons to other slow executions reveal why sawing was so feared. Lingqi tore the flesh piece by piece, but sawing cut through the core of a body, splitting it in two. Impalement left a body pierced and exposed, but sawing was an intimate brutality, a blade kissing every inch of the body's insides on its path. Flaying stripped the skin to expose living nerves, but sawing tore flesh, muscle, and bone in a deliberate rhythm of destruction. In each culture that used it, whether in medieval Europe, Persia, or parts of Asia, sawing in half was a punishment that was meant to be remembered. It was designed to leave a stain on the public's mind, to serve as a constant, bloody reminder of what defiance or crime could bring. In the end, it was not just the blade that killed the victim, but the fear, humiliation, and the methodical cruelty of a society that turned execution into theatre. Each scream, each splinter of bone, each gasp of air, as the blade reached deeper, became part of a spectacle that fed the power of rulers and the fear of the masses. Sawing in half was not just about the physical act of execution. It was a tool of psychological warfare designed to break the spirit before it broke the body. For many, the fear of capture and the threat of sawing was a punishment in itself, often worse than the crime's original consequences. In medieval Europe and parts of Asia, the mere rumor that authorities would use sawing was enough to send entire villages into submission. Rebels fled, thieves begged for mercy, and prisoners confessed to crimes they may not have committed just to avoid the blade's promise of agony. Victims often experienced psychological collapse long before the saw ever touched them. Locked in dank, fetid cells, they would hear the stories of those who went before them. How long they screamed, how long they bled, how long they stayed alive. Executioners would sometimes show them the saw, running a finger along its teeth, while reminding the prisoner of what was coming. Some victims would lose their minds, babbling incoherently, while others would bargain, weep, or attempt suicide to escape what was waiting. For the families and communities forced to witness these executions, the trauma was equally scarring. Public executions were mandatory viewing for many. Lesson. Meant to instill fear and obedience. Children clung to their mothers, forced to watch neighbors or relatives split in two, each scream tearing into the fabric of communal safety. Markets and town squares, normally places of life, commerce, and gossip, became arenas of death where the smell of blood and fear clung to the cobblestones for days. Humiliation was layered upon the agony. Victims were stripped naked, their bodies exposed in front of the entire community, stripping them of dignity before stripping them of life. Crowds often jeered, mocked, or spat on the condemned, turning their final moments into a spectacle of ridicule. Some threw rotten vegetables, others shouted insults, and a few wept silently, unable to reconcile the cruelty of what they were witnessing with the life they knew. The slow pace of sawing meant that the victim could see the faces of the crowd, hear the laughter or the cries, and feel the sun on their skin while the blade inched closer to their heart. They would hear the rasp of the saw, smell their own blood, and see their body split open, a slow revelation of organs and bones, all while fully conscious, fully aware. The psychological horror was complete. The fear of the coming pain, the humiliation of public nudity, the knowledge that death would not be swift, and the final realization that every breath, every heartbeat was bringing them closer to a slow, brutal end. For those left behind, it was a memory that would haunt them, a warning that the ruler's power was absolute, and that defiance could bring a punishment worse than death. In the world that allowed sawing in half as a punishment, terror was not a side effect, it was the purpose. As the centuries turned and laws across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia began to modernize, sawing in half fell out of favor, not because rulers grew merciful, but because Enlightenment ideas began to spread like a cautious dawn across the old, blood-soaked systems of justice. By the 17th and 18th centuries, a new awareness was rising that punishment should fit crime, and cruelty for cruelty's sake did nothing but degrade society as a whole. Thinkers, philosophers, and even some rulers began questioning whether tearing a person apart publicly truly maintained order, or simply fed the worst instincts of those watching. Humanitarian shifts and Enlightenment philosophy condemned the brutality of punishment, like sawing, flaying, and breaking on the wheel. Legal reforms began sweeping through kingdoms and empires, replacing execution spectres with faster, less torturous methods, often beheading or hanging. Courts slowly phased out these horrors, recognizing them as relics of a darker time. The last recorded uses of sawing in half fade into obscurity by the 18th century, though whispers and scattered folklore claims persisted, particularly in remote regions where fear still ruled over law. Traveling merchants and soldiers still carried the stories of sawings in hushed tones, but they became warnings of the past, rather than realities of the present. Sawing in half became a ghost of history, a symbol of how brutal power could be when left unchecked, and how societies could change, however slowly, because in the end, even the darkest systems eventually let go of the saw. Cruelty wasn't just a byproduct of history. It was institutionalized, woven into the systems of fear and control that rulers used to keep people in line. Sawing in half was more than a punishment. It was a message, carved into flesh to echo in the minds of communities for generations. It's easy to look back and think we've moved beyond such horrors, that these tools of terror are relics locked in the past. But the truth is, the human capacity for brutality remains, waiting, reminding us that under the right conditions, societies can return to darkness in the name of power and order. It is why we tell these stories, not to glorify the horror, but to remember the suffering, the fear, and the voices that were silenced beneath the saw. History is dark, and we must remember it.